He puts it away, and David Wells has pitched a perfect game. David Cole wants David Wells to come back out for a curtain call. The fans are sticking around. That's the last out that'll net at the world.
In Texas, a few starts later, they carry him off the field here at Yankee Stadium.
Welcome to one and all. This is episode 189 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on this Friday night in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, turn on those notifications. So today is the 26th anniversary of the best game, baseball that is, I ever saw pitched. The best game, my dear old dad, the biggest Yankee fan in history, may he rest in peace, the best game he ever saw pitched. And a game where the pitcher was so dominant that in 27 outs, there was one well-struck baseball. 11 strikeouts, and everything else, pop-ups, dribblers, and soft fly balls. On May 17, 1998, at OG Yankee Stadium, the house that Ruth built, David Wells pitched a perfect game against the Minnesota Twins. And I wish I could tell you that I was at the game, but sadly, Dad and I watched it from the comfort of home. It was a Sunday, and we knew early in the game that he had something special that day. Now, he had had a 17 strikeout game, and I thought maybe it was going to be something like that. Certainly never expecting perfect game or no-hitter. But David Wells was a unicorn. He was a true outlier in a sense that he had talent level that even in a sport filled with people who are prodigiously talented at that sport, David Wells was still different because he didn't look like an athlete. And yes, there are plenty of baseball players who certainly, as they got older, whether it's Babe Ruth, whether it's Tony Gwynn, they started to look more like a regular person than a professional athlete. David Wells always looked like a regular person, and that kind of everyman quality is one reason why he was so endearing, even though he wasn't necessarily that big of a personality in a good sense. He could be crotchety. He sometimes showed up his teammates if they made errors, but he did have that everyman quality, and he seemed like a normal guy. He liked to party. He liked to go out and go crazy, and he was generous with his money when he would see people in public, you know, picking up the check and stuff like that. But he was never really, I should say he never appeared to be in shape, because in order to do what he did and have complete games where he threw 130 pitches, 140 pitches, your cardio has to be pretty fucking good. And David Wells was an outlier in that sense too, because he didn't look like, it looked like a quarter of a mile jog and he was going to collapse, and maybe he would have. But when it came to toeing the slab, 60 feet 6 inches, man, when he was in his prime, his command was so precise. The control, popping a fastball 95, the jackhammer, hard curve, the big overhand curve. He did everything well. And from a fundamental standpoint, he was a pitcher whose delivery, and this is another reason why the guy really didn't get injured, he had a repeatable delivery, and he did everything. And Jim Cott, the former Yankees announcer, used to talk about this. He said there are certain pitchers who have such perfect mechanics that you wonder how they ever get hurt. Greg Maddux was one, Mike Mussina was another, and David Wells was another. And Cott, who himself was a pitcher, 287 career victories, almost a Hall of Famer. He marveled at how David Wells from pitch to pitch looked exactly the same. Everything was in the exact same sequence. It didn't appear that he was a fraction off. And that is something that you really can't teach. the ability, because every pitcher, if they could have great mechanics or the ability to not get injured, they would all try. But Wells just had a beautiful, fluid delivery. He didn't look like a kind of guy who would have he looked like a herky-jerky sort of a guy who would do that, but he had that perfect delivery. And his career as a whole is strange. He's like, his career has parallels with Ron Guidry, the great Yankees lefty who had Hall of Fame caliber talent, Hall of Fame seasons, Hall of Fame postseason situations, but did not make the Hall of Fame because his prime kind of started a little bit late. But in the case of Guidry, it's more that his prime and near prime ended too early. Ron Guidry's numbers are stupendous and spectacular. He just didn't do it long enough. You know, 320 game wins, 20 win seasons, but his prime was basically 1977 through 1980. Even though he had 22 20-win seasons after that, he didn't throw the same way. David Wells didn't really start to kind of harness his extraordinary ability until he was in his early 30s. And he had his moments with Toronto. That's who he started with. He won a World Series with them in 1992. But he didn't really get it. He was a guy with great stuff, but, you know, I guess maybe the partying, maybe the fact that he didn't take his talent seriously, who knows? But he ended up his career with 239 wins. And most of them, almost all of them, came after he was 30. And that's really weird and rare. By the time Wells left Toronto, 1993, he had kind of gotten it, and he had a pretty good year with the Tigers. And I remember when the Yankees got him before the 97 season, I was very excited, even though we were giving up Jimmy Key, who had won Game 6 of the World Series. But I knew that Wells was still in his prime. And Jimmy Key, who, oh man, but I love Jimmy Key. He was another guy with Toronto. He was Wells' teammate with Toronto, who was absolute money, a great pitcher, a guy who could pop the fastball in the low 90s, but was a touch and feel pitcher. But he was kind of past it, and Wells was still pretty much in his prime, even as he was in his 30s. And he had a big year in 97, pitched very well in the postseason. The Yankees lost a really tough series to Cleveland, one of Mariano's few failures where they were trying to win Game 4. Mariano gave up a homer to Sandy Alomar, and we ended up losing the series in 5. But Wells, in Game 3, threw a complete game. And, man, he was money. He was money in the postseason. He rarely gave you a shitty performance in the postseason. And then 98, when he was like 34, 35, he hit another gear. And he was a Cy Young contender in addition to the perfect game. And then after that, he had a 20-win season when the Yankees traded him, the kind of controversial trade. The Yankees traded him to Toronto for Roger Clemens. And they ended up winning 2 more World Series with Clemens. And Clemens certainly performed really well through the 2003 season. But he was Roger Clemens. He was an asshole. You know, he was a very polarizing guy. As much as Wells sometimes aggravated his teammates, Clemens was a guy the Yankees had issues with when he was on Toronto because he kept throwing at everybody. Clemens always threw at people. He hit Brocious, he hit Jeter, you know, it's Steinbrenner crying, and then, you know, Joe Torre saying, I love Roger as a pitcher, but it's disgusting that he gets away with this. We all know he throws at people. But then, when Roger came to the Yankees, and he very clearly tried to kill Mike Piazza with a baseball, all of a sudden, Joe Torre, it's disgusting that you would think he would do it. Bro, you're one of the people that said he did it. Don't blame it on anybody else. But I digress, as I often do. David Wells had stupendous talent, despite the fact that he was just as likely to come to the ballpark with a splitting headache, maybe from too much partying the previous night. And he had struggled somewhat in the early portion of 1998. And Joe Torre had huge respect for Wells' talent, but he also thought he was just not, he wasn't as focused. I mean, maybe to compare him to Andy Pettitte and David Cohn is not really a great comparison because those guys, their preparation was different. But Torre felt that Wells just didn't take his talent seriously enough. And he hated the fact that he often showed up. If Jeter was slow getting to a ground ball, Wells would huff and puff on the mound. Even though he and Jeter had a good relationship, it pissed off Torre. And it was a game, a couple of starts before the perfect game, where Wells was taken out early. And he didn't, you know, they thought maybe he was injured. He wasn't injured. And after the game, they asked Torrey, said, Joe, what did you see? You know, he really would give up a couple of runs. And Torrey said, I didn't like his body language. And the way he said it was, he was showing up his teammates on the mound, and he was coming across like he didn't care, and I can't have that. We can't even have the appearance of it. We have to be competitive, and we have to respect our teammates, etc., etc. So then in Wells' next start, he struggled early. And, you know, they started talking about, you know, the old Susan Waldman, John, what are we going to do with this guy, John? You know, the way that she used to carry on in the booth if a Yankee pitcher had a couple of shitty starts. You know, what are you going to do? If he's making $20 million a year, Susan, he's going to pitch 5 days from now. That's what they're going to do. They're not going to take him out of the rotation. But in the case of Wells, he had burned bridges. It's different when, you know, years later, A.J. Burnett was just horrendous and pitching like crap. But nobody questioned that Burnett was trying. It's when Wells was seemingly not giving the best effort or, you know, stomping around on the mound in a way that pissed off his manager. You can't really do that. And it wouldn't fly with someone like Aaron Boone or Joe Girardi, for that matter. So he turned it around on that particular day. And then the next start was May 17th. And the story goes that Wells was out late the previous night, and he was not feeling the best when he got to the ballpark in the Bronx that day. And remember, in 1998, well, I shouldn't say remember, not everybody knows this, the Yankees ended up with 114 wins. They might have been the greatest baseball team in the history of baseball. Like, they're in the conversation. They ended up winning 125 games, including postseason. They were a juggernaut for almost the entire season. They had a little stretch in September where they lost like 5 out of 6 or some 7 out of 10. But they were a juggernaut. They weren't just winning, they were embarrassing other teams. They had some kind of crazy record at Yankee Stadium against teams with losing records. They only lost like 3 games all year. It was some stupid, crazy stat that you don't see in baseball. So Wells got to the park that day, supposedly, wasn't feeling that great. And Torrey was a little concerned, presumably because this fucking guy, he's probably drunk. And he was worried. He needed Wells to show that, hey, you're part of this team. You had a nice year last year, and we see the stuff is there. What's he going to do? So Wells went and did his bullpen, the bullpen session, where you just get a little warmed up. You don't want to burn yourself out, and you just start trying to hit spots with your pitches. So Torrey sent Mel Stottlemyre, former Yankee and a terrific pitching coach. His son Todd Stottlemyre had a nice career. He sent Stottlemyre out there. He says, all right, you know, I don't know what to expect, but let me know how he looks. And Stottlemyre went out with David Wells, and I think Dale Swaim, who had just retired, was the bullpen catcher, if I'm not mistaken. So Wells did his bullpen session before the game, and when Mel Stottlemyre got back to the dugout, Torrey said, well, what do you think? And Mel Stottlemyre, according to Joe Torre's own account, just looked at Torrey, shook his head, and said, wow. And that was something that Mel Stottlemyre had never done before. The translation that Torrey then gave was, once he got his arm loose, he hit every spot within a fraction with every pitch he threw. Now, I guess pitchers can do that, but somebody like Wells, who was known for command, this was a very good sign. It showed there was at least a chance that he was going to have a big game. But I'm sure there were other days where he was hitting the numbers, and days where Mariano Rivera could knock off an ant off of somebody's head on top of an apple from 100 yards. Sometimes you just get hit. Wells went out that day, and oddly enough, the Yankees were facing LaTroy Hawkins, who was, I think, a rookie at the time. LaTroy Hawkins was still pitching in 2016. He had a really long career. But the Yankees scored early. Bernie Williams, I think, hit a 3-run homer to give Boomer, you know, a little bit of a breather. And again, the Yankees were running away with the division. This was not a game like pressure-packed early season, you know, Yankees and Red Sox in other years neck and neck, and it's a big game. They were just killing everybody. They started the season famously 1-4, And we were going to fire Joe Torre. Talk radio was fucking hilarious. The Yankees had come off, you know, a big season in 97, the World Series in 96. They had a huge team on paper. And they start 1-4, and they're sharpening the knives. Is Joe on the hot seat? It's not fucking football. There's not 11 games left, and the Jets are doomed. They had 157 games left. So after the 1-4 start, they went 17-1 or some crazy, it may have even been 18-1. They just went berserk. So they immediately took control of the division and they were on cruise control. So Wells started off, and you know, you're watching a baseball game and the other team doesn't have any hits or base runners in the first few minutes. It doesn't mean anything. It happens all the time. But what my dad would say is that when you have a lead early and your pitcher looks great and has not either given up any hits or walks or both, when it gets to even as early as the 4th inning, you start to be aware and you start to pay attention to the fact that they haven't gotten any base runners yet. And Wells has got great stuff. Maybe this will be a special day. And the fact that Wells had a 17 strikeout game the previous year in what I think was a 3-hitter. It was either a 2 or a 3-hitter. He was just dominant. And the somewhat, at the time, notorious because he had a big strike zone, John Hirschbeck, who famously had run afoul of Roberto Alomar, and then the two guys actually made up and they did charity work together. So that story, unlike most when you have issues with umpires, you know, like Angel Hernandez, John Hirschbeck had a wide strike zone. When you take a pitcher like David Wells, who can pop the fastball at 95, put it where he wants, who can throw the slider where he wants, can throw the big lollipop overhand curve to within 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch almost every time when he's on, you have a recipe for a special day. And Wells had a lot of strikeouts early, and we get to the 5th inning, strikeout, dribbler, 6th inning, 7th inning. When he got through the 7th, and he actually, I think in the 7th inning was behind in a count, 3-1 on a batter, and we're like, all right, you know, if he walks him, it's not the end of the world. You're still thinking no-hitter. But he got out of that, and through 7 innings, and I think it was 7 1/3, not one ball hit with anything other than they got under it by a mile, they topped a dribbler back to the mound, a dribbler to third base, a dribbler to Jeter, you know, a ground ball for Tino Martinez, a little squibber to first. It's nothing but pop-ups, soft fly balls, dribblers, and strikeouts. And then with 1 out in the 8th inning, I don't think it was Paul Molitor. I'm not sure who the hitter was. Maybe it was Pat Mears. Somebody hit a smash and a frozen rope, 1 hop, crushed at a fielder at Chuck Knobloch. Now, Chuck Knobloch, a little bit of an unfortunate figure in Yankees lore, even though he won 3 straight World Series with the team, because he got to the Yankees as a kind of perennial all-star second baseman, a 300 hitter with some pop, and a terrific defensive player. I mean, he was, I don't want to say a marginal Hall of Famer, but he was a guy who was on pace for a great career, and he had made the All-Star team the year before he got to the Yankees. In the spring, he started having trouble getting the ball to first base. He's playing second. It's not like it's a long throw to first base. When he took his normal windup and throw to first, he was likely to either throw the ball over the first baseman's head or throw it 10 feet to Tino's right or 10 feet to his left. They call it the yips. It's some kind of bizarre psychological issue that does not make any sense. And he's not the only one to have it. Rick Ankiel had it. He was a pitcher who then had to become an outfielder. And to a lesser extent, the Mets catcher, Mackey Sasser, had difficulty getting the ball back to the pitcher. He had to stand up and throw it to the pit. Like, it was just, like, what's going on here? Well, shit happens. So Chuck Knobloch, that spring, and it's almost absurd, but the, at the time, sports commentator turned kind of like mainstream political commentator, or, you know, left, whatever you want to say, Keith Olbermann. It's just so stupid, but Keith Olbermann, lifelong Yankee fan, he had tickets. He still has tickets to the Yankees. And one of the ironies, speaking of politics, is that he and Sean Hannity, for all of that, they used to yap at each other on the air back and forth. They used to go to the Yankee games. They were sitting next to each other. They weren't really enemies. It was for TV. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't have said that they weren't really enemies in real life. But Keith Olbermann he used to sometimes go to the spring training games. He's as I say, he's a real fan, not making any judgment. There's plenty of fans that I disagree with and plenty of fans that I agree with on stuff, and they're Met fans. Hey, fuck them, like that kind of thing. It's sports, baby. But Keith Olbermann's mom, who didn't have any axe to grind with anybody, she was sitting behind first base in Tampa during a spring training game, and Knobloch, when I tell you he airmailed a throw, he threw it about 20 feet over Tino Martinez's head. It hit Keith Olbermann's mom. Now, she wasn't injured, but that's so absurd. But it happened. So with that in mind, and the fact that Knobloch had already made a number of errors in the first, 7 weeks or whatever it was of the 1998 season, when Chuck fielded that ball, my dad and I, at the same time, we both screamed, "Oh shit!" Because Wells is 5 outs from a perfect game. Any other second baseman gets the ball to first base, and he's 4 outs from a perfect game. And baseball immortality. And he had to hit it to Chuck Knobloch. We had the exact same series of thoughts in that split second that Chuck gloved it. It was a nice play. It was a play that a good second baseman would make because the ball was hit to him. It took kind of a tough hop, but it was far enough away. There was nothing wrong with his reflexes. He grabbed it. We screamed, "Oh shit," and Knobloch could not lollipop it. He had to turn and fire. And it's like the baseball gods were on the Yankees side that day and had been on their side since 1995. And Chuck Knobloch turned, wheeled, and threw a fucking frozen rope and hit the middle of Tino Martinez's glove. And not only did my dad and I both scream, exult, but the entire ballpark, I'm telling you, anybody who was a fan of the team was thinking the exact same thing in those desperate seconds. Chuck is going to throw this ball into the fucking stands. And he did not. He put it right in the glove. And so I think the next batter either struck out or popped up. And in the ninth inning, it wasn't that it was anticlimactic, but it was 2 very quick and very easy outs. And like there are certain plays where the ball isn't hit hard and it ends up being a tough play, or heaven forbid a fielder can lose it in the sun. And there was a play where Ricky Leday seemed to have trouble picking up the flight of the ball. He was a rookie at the time, didn't have the career they thought he would. A tremendous talent, like almost a 5-tool talent. He just didn't have the career, but he had a big World Series. He had a huge hit in the first game of the World Series, which was won by David Wells, I should point out. But when it got to 2 outs, there was a sense that he was going to do it. And we almost, or at least me, it was almost inconceivable that David Wells was not going to throw the perfect game. He was so dialed in. Even in the ninth inning, having thrown 120 or however many pitches it was, and maybe the fastball wasn't quite as fast, it didn't have quite as much zip, but he was still hitting his spots. He was still putting the ball where he wanted to on every pitch. And you know what my dad always said? There's a lot of basic sayings in the sport of baseball. Captain Obvious type stuff. But one of those is there are no bad hops in the air. And the terrific Toronto Blue Jays pitcher, Dave Stieb, lost a couple of no-hitters, but one in particular on a bad hop. You hit a grounder and the ball takes a strange bounce and hops over the fielder's head. It's a base hit. They can't call it an error. But when you hit a ball in the air, like high in the air, where you know the fielder is at least going to be able to camp under it, when you do that, it's just a matter of the fielder not tripping, falling down, or not securing the baseball. When, I'm not sure if it was Mears, but when the Minnesota Twins batter lofted a high pop-up to right field, and Jim Cott, who I mentioned, was doing the color, if you listen to it and watch it, he almost can't believe what he is calling. because he is watching a perfect game in real time. And the way he says, O'Neill appears to have room, almost in shock, because there's no bad hops in the air. And Paul O'Neill, a great right fielder, I don't care who it is, no right fielder is dropping that ball in that spot. It was a perfect day for visibility. And when O'Neill made that catch, Dad screamed, I screamed, the ballpark went berserk. It was Beanie Baby Day at Yankee Stadium. And so it was a bigger crowd than there normally would be. It was just about a sellout. They all stayed. Almost no one left. Once you start getting into it, you're not going anywhere with a perfect game. So Wells pumped his fist, and all the exultation, and Jorge Posada was the catcher. Joe Girardi was still the primary starter, I believe, in 1998. But Posada caught the game, and Wells celebrated, and Torrey, everybody was happy, even those who maybe thought, you know, Boomer's just, he does his own thing. He marches to his own tune. He was not really like the voice of reason in the clubhouse. He was not beloved. He was kind of tolerated, but everyone was overjoyed. And Jim Leyritz, who at the time was with the Boston Red Sox, told a funny story in later years that Pedro Martinez, it was his first year with Boston, and what Jim Leyritz couldn't believe is that Pedro Martinez, the future Hall of Famer and one of the greatest pitchers who ever lived, prime Pedro Martinez, top 5. That's how good that guy was. What a fucking monster pitcher. But Pedro Martinez, despite the fact he had no affinity for the Yankees, he loved Mariano Rivera, but he hated the Yankees. The Yankees, you know, were his daddies in later years. But Jim Leyritz said, we're all watching the game. The Red Sox game didn't start until, like, I guess 5 o'clock that day. And when Wells got the perfect game, when O'Neill squeezed it, Leyritz said he could not believe how excited Leyritz said he could not believe how excited Pedro got. And it's just because Pedro, even as a very young man, it was a baseball history thing. Pedro was excited because he got to see history. It didn't matter to him that this is the hated Yankees. And Leyritz said, I never could have imagined a Red Sox player like Pedro Martinez cheering on a Yankee. But he was cheering for the history. And David Wells' perfect game was only the 15th perfect game in the history of Major League Baseball. There had already been some 200,000 games by that point, and this was the 15th, and only the 15th. Wells ended up, as I say, having a big season. He didn't win the Cy Young that year. I think he finished 3rd, but Roger Clemens, who he was about to be traded for, won back-to-back Cy Young awards, and Roger was a deserving winner. He was tremendous. He was absolutely awesome. And you had other pitchers like Pat Henkin, I think, had a big year that year. And did David Cone win 20? But Wells was the Yankees' ace, even with Pettit and even with David Cone. And Orlando Hernandez, who had a big year. He came up a little bit later. Wells was the guy, and he started game 1 of all 3 rounds of playoffs. And he pitched great against Texas in game 1 of that series, which the Yankees swept. And he really pitched a great game in game 5. I mean, he won game 1. The Yankees blew out Jarrett Wright and the Indians. And then they lost. Knobloch had a fucking idiot brain fart in game 2 and cost us a chance to win that game, realistically. And then the Yankees lost game 3. And they were in trouble. They ended up tying the series in game 4. Orlando El Duque Hernandez was fantastic. And Wells went out in game 5 and pitched brilliantly. And the Yankees then won that game and won the series in 6. And in the World Series, he got the win in game 1, but he got hit really hard. And if Bruce Bochy, the Padres manager, had managed his bullpen better, the Padres probably win game 1. They had a 5-2 lead going to the bottom of the 7th. They, you know, statistically, they were about 85 to 90% to win that game. Bochy either took round out too soon, whatever he was. He didn't manage it correctly, I don't think. The Yankees ended up winning that game, and then they went ahead and swept that series. But David Wells' perfect game, 1 hard hit ball, 11 strikeouts, and nothing but pop-ups, soft fly balls, and dribblers. The single best game I ever saw pitched. And I saw Roy Halladay throw some gems, you know, the famous, what was it, postseason. He threw a perfect game. Was it that he threw a perfect game in the postseason and a no-hitter in the regular season? I'm not sure. But I watched Roy Halladay throw some incredible games. I saw Maddox throw 68 pitches in a shutout. David Wells that day, 26 years ago today, the best game I've ever seen pitched, and the best game that most Yankee fans will ever see pitched. This has been episode 189 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Friday evening with me here in New York. If you caught this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoyed it, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 190 real soon. Until then, peace.